This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Let us go now to letters. I got a wonderful letter. That's another axe I like to grind. And this is a letter from John in Mesa, Arizona. Did congregations in the first centuries have the Gospels and the Pauline letters? How scarce were parchments of the four Gospels and the letters of Paul? Did the average congregation have any of these, or did they discuss the creeds and oral transmission of the Gospel? That's a tough question, but it's answerable. And it goes to a wider question, I think, that is really, really interesting. We have a huge number of early Christian manuscripts relative to other documents. We have 11 small pieces of scripture from the first century. This is important. Only 11? Yeah, 11. 11 manuscripts that come from within a long lifetime after the time of Jesus. Now, that's not many. Oh, that's a lot. The New Testament, it's the most documented of ancient texts. I think that that's important to understand, that there are more biblical manuscripts. The New Testament has been preserved in more manuscripts than any other ancient work of literature, with over 5,800 complete or fragmented Greek manuscripts cataloged. There are 10,000 Latin manuscripts and 9,300 manuscripts in other ancient languages. That's huge. And from the first century, from the very beginning, we have 11. We have none of Julius Caesar or Cicero or Tacitus or any of these ancient authors. There are none of them. The first copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey, I think they're post-Christian. I mean, they don't exist. Paper is a fragile thing. And parchment, this is going to take some splaining, but the parchment was made from reeds, and these reeds grew in the Nile Delta. What you would do is you would take these reeds and cut them open and then bang on them with a kind of hammer, and then you'd put another layer of reeds perpendicular to them, and you came up with a sheet of paper. And that's the only place that in the West that paper came from. Paper comes to us, as we know paper, comes to us from Asia, from China. The other writing material was parchment. St. Paul says in one of his letters, says, bring my writing materials and my winter coat, especially the parchments. Parchments were expensive. To write a book, you had to kill a whole flock of sheep. That parchment was dried, processed sheepskin. And sometimes I think they also used calfskin, but I think that was even more expensive. It was a very expensive process. And so there were not many books. For a person to own 10 or 20 books would have been like owning 10 or 20 computers. More than that. And these things were read and used, and they wore out and fell apart. I think that's an important kind of thing to remember. Now, another dimension, the ancient world, up until the time of Christ, wrote on scrolls. And you usually and these scrolls were made out of parchment or papyrus. And the usual approach was to write on one side. If you really were trying to save paper, you'd write on both sides of the scroll, but it was unusual to do that, and it was kind of cheap. And you had a hard time finding something. Oh, it's about an inch down in the scroll. That's why people say, how come in the Catholic Church, when we say the Gospel of the Lord according to Luke, we don't say chapter 5, verse 8? Because we've been doing it since before there was chapter and verse. You just sort of yay far down in the scroll, and you knew where it was. Chapters came in probably 200 years after Christ, and verse didn't come into the scripture until, I think, 1550, about the Geneva Bible, produced by Calvinists in Switzerland. Chapter and verse are not part of the text, and we divide things up with chapter and verse, not part of the sacred text. Early Christians were so fixed on the texts that they might not have invented it, but they popularized a new form of writing material, or a new form of publishing. Maybe that's the way to put it. They invented what's called the codex. To make a parchment scroll or a papyrus scroll, you had to glue the papyrus together and make a long roll, or you sewed the parchment sheets together. And they didn't do that. They didn't put them together. They kept them separate. And that meant if you put them between two wooden covers. General writing in the ancient world was on what they called was a wooden kind of frame. Into it you poured wax, and you jot things down in wax, and then with a stylus, with a sharp thing, you'd write in the wax, and then when you wanted to write something else, you just scraped off the wax and wrote, and when you ran out of wax, you poured more wax in. And this idea, they thought, why don't we do that with paper? We'll put it between two boards, and that way we'll have all these pages. And you can turn the page and you write on both sides of the page, and then you can find the page more easily. You won't have to unroll the entire scroll. And these codexes were smaller than scrolls, and you could sort of tuck them in your pocket kind of thing. They invented the portable book. They popularized it. Maybe they didn't invent it, but they popularized it. And one of the great crimes of the early church was to hand over the sacred books. That was equivalent to denying Christ. And the Romans wanted to destroy the Christian books. So you'd be arrested and say, where are your sacred texts? And you'd say, oh, they're over there. Be nice to me. I'll sacrifice to the emperor. But he said, I will not give up the sacred text. You were killed for that when there was persecution. So the early church, by the year 200, really was using books. Before that, what did they do? They might have used, when they talked about the scriptures, they were talking about what we call the Old Testament. They might have had some different copies of sacred, of Gospels or of Pauline letters. But by the year 200, they were really using sacred texts. So I think that's a very interesting question that John from Mesa is asking. So gradually, these texts became standardized. How scarce were the parchments of the four Gospels? They were not scarce at all relative to other texts. They were plentiful. And did the average congregation have any of these? The average congregation might have had certainly the Hebrew scriptures, and they might have had some letters and different communications, but they got around pretty fast. So I just think that's rather interesting. And again, it's hard to step into the mindset, but by the year 200, certainly by 250, we're talking about the text pretty much in the way that we experience it. Now, it wasn't a book. The Bible was never thought of as a book until 350 AD, when the Byzantine emperors and the Pope decided to publish the whole collection of sacred texts. As believers, we have been studying a sacred text since the beginning. The reading of Scripture in the earliest church would have been from what we call the Old Testament, and the preaching of the gospel was done from the Old Testament. They would talk about what Christ had done and refer to the Old Testament works. And in a sense, it wasn't necessary at that point to read those texts because everybody had them memorized if it was a largely Jewish Christian congregation. That's my suspicion. But it's fascinating. Again, this is entering into the mindset and the experience of a people far away and 2,000 years ago. It's not easy, but we're doing our best to do it. So I thanks for that letter, John. It's one of my favorite axes to grind. All right.
Like what you just heard? Share it with your family and friends, and thanks for listening.